Welcome everybody that's joined. We're delighted to have you with you. We're just going to wait another minute to allow people that may be moving between a physical and online meeting or moving from their last online meeting to this one. So lovely that you can join us, and thank you for being on time, but we won't hold you up too much longer. Just to check with those that are joining us, can you see the screen okay? And if so, please do start doing what it's asking you to do.
Yes, we can see it well, I think so.
Great, thank you, Aniko. Okay, everybody. I make that 1 minute past. I'm conscious that we're towards the end of some people's day, at the beginning of other people's days. So thank you for being up or early, or for being with us towards the end of your working day. So I propose that we just get started. So good day to you all, and welcome. We're really delighted to have you join us today. I'm Chris Smith. I am one of the two co-chairs of the SEFI Special Interest Group on Continuing Engineering Education and Lifelong Learning. And on behalf of SEFI, myself and the other co-chair of the SIG, Professor Aniko Kalman, who joins us, it is our pleasure to welcome you to this SEFI at Work session. Today's session is part of a series focusing on individual chapters from the International Handbook for Engineering Education Research, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But some housekeeping first, as we always have to do. Please note we're recording the session with the intention of sharing this afterwards, so should you want to turn off your camera, then please do so. The recording will be made available shortly afterwards on the SEFI YouTube channel. Some rules of engagement for today. You're welcome to interact with the chat and with the question and answers. Please use the chat for discussion amongst yourselves, sharing thoughts or experiences, and I'm sure our speakers today will be getting you to use that, so I'm really looking forward to that. At the appropriate moments in the second half, then there'll be an opportunity to raise your hand, and you can unmute yourself if you've got a question to ask. Please note that the use of bots for note-taking is not permitted, and these tools will be removed by the moderators. Whilst we understand the advantage and value of AI tools for ensuring inclusive access, we're aware of concerns relating to privacy and the safety of data. Okay, housekeeping done. Now to the exciting bit. So now to today's session. This SEFI work session is based on Chapter 16 of the brilliant International Handbook for Engineering Education Research. That chapter is entitled Enabling a Skilled and Diverse Engineering Workforce with Non-Degree Credentials. There are three brilliant authors of this chapter, Helen L, Chen, Isabel Cardenas-Navia, and Abasolo Cosimo, and we're delighted that two of them can join us today, Helen and Isabel. Helen is a research scientist in the Center for Design Research in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. And if that wasn't enough, she's also the co-founder of the Integrative Learning Portfolio Lab in Stanford Career Education. Her scholarship is focused on engineering and entrepreneurship education, reflective practices, certificates and non-degree credentials, and reimagining how learners communicate their stories through their professional online presence. Isabel works as a senior consultant at WorkCreds. In that role, she supports WorkCreds' research agenda and examines workforce credentialing issues and needs. Previously, she was the vice president of programs with the Business Higher Education Forum. Through her career, she led and facilitated projects bringing together Fortune 500 employers and higher education institutions, and successfully applying for funding from a range of organizations. And prior to that, Isabel was president and founder of Altavision Consulting, where she provided short-term project-based consulting in policy and workforce development in scientific and technical fields. Wow, two amazing speakers. Delighted to have that contrast between those that are still in academia and those that are obviously bridging that gap. So Helen and Isabel are going to lead the rest of this roughly in two parts. They will talk and outline the chapter, engage us. I know that they've talked about that, so I'm really looking forward to those questions. As you go along, please feel free to type in any questions that you might have, and there'll be a session at the end where we can get and dig into those questions. Enough from me. Helen, Isabel, we are so delighted to have you with us today. I'm really excited, so over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate that warm welcome and this opportunity to be able to share some of the ideas and questions that came out of our chapter with the SEFI community. As Chris mentioned, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like, so we know a little bit more about who's here in the room today. We recognize there's a lot of collective expertise and interests and perspectives here, and so we would certainly love this opportunity to learn from you. At the same time, as Chris mentioned, please feel free to use the chat for any questions that may arise. Isabel and I, together with Chris, will be monitoring as we go, and we'll try to address and respond to all of your questions, or certainly we invite everyone here to also respond to the questions. And if we don't get to it today during this session, we'd be happy to follow up. I have to say that Isabel and I designed this session to really intentionally prioritize the people who are here with us live so we can have this discussion. So even though the session will be recorded and posted later, we're really hoping to really engage all of you today. So how we've organized this session is around four general areas. First of all, just wanting to establish a shared understanding of this space, and of credentials. And I'm so thrilled that Isabel will be able to bring her expertise and knowledge, to, really the definitional kinds of considerations. Second, why non-degree credentials? Why is this something that we're exploring, particularly in engineering and education? Third, what are the needs do non-degree credentials address? And then lastly, exploring future directions. I do have to be honest here in that when we were developing this chapter, there was a question, the space is still evolving and emerging. And so this question came up. It's like, okay, how are we going to capture this in a handbook that's going to be published a year later and may already be dated? So this is actually what we tried to do, was kind of establish some of those foundational concepts and questions, but obviously things are still continuing to evolve. So as Chris mentioned, this is who we are. Abisela as a former, or as an alumna from Stanford, and is now exploring and working in the field. She's sorry she can't join us today, but definitely is a key partner in our chapter's efforts. And then lastly, did also want to include a link to our chapter, which I'll also put in the chat. Again, we've designed this session not so much to, actually, summarize the chapter per se, but invite you to kind of check it out if you would like to learn more about what we discussed today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Isabel to help us with defining non-degree credentials.
Thanks, Helen. So for anyone who, so let me just start saying WorkCred, the organization I work with, really looks at the relevance, market value, and quality of credentials. And we focus almost exclusively on non-degree credentials, although we obviously look at how they interact with degrees. And so we start almost every presentation we do with this particular graphic, where we really try to define what do we mean by credentials and these different sort of non-degree credentials underneath it. And so credential we're really using as this umbrella term. And so it encompasses everything, including degrees. It encompasses both those awarded by higher education institutions, as well as those, licenses or badges or credentials, which are awarded by, in the United States, right, state agencies, regulatory agencies, or private providers as well. And so we really, as we're talking today, really do distinguish between all of these different credentials. It's really important for us to think about this. And when we're talking about non-degree credentials today, we're talking about everything here other than a degree. Next slide. And so just to, again, ground our conversation a little bit, I think we're going to be talking largely about my familiarity is largely with the United States system. And so these are the types of credentials, if we're talking about higher education institutions, that are offered to undergraduates. And so Obviously, associates programs, baccalaureate programs, those are fairly certainly vary by institution, but they're largely understood in terms of, you know, what the number of credit hours or the sort of knowledge they represent, particularly in engineering programs. When you look at non-degree credentials in the United States, certificates, micro-credentials, or badges, these are vary greatly by the issuer in terms of what they represent, whether it's credit hours, whether it is assessment, there are any assessments involved, or anyone sort of, or understanding who's developing those assessments or making those assessments. And they're often not listed in an academic transcript. And so in some ways, right, even if they are co-curricular, that may or not may be there. And we see a lot of variety even within an institution when you're looking at, you know, what a micro-credential or certificate may be. And certainly you see a variety within university systems or college systems and across different systems. Next slide. So one of the things that we really think about at WorkCred is when we're thinking about non-degree credentials, you know, how do we differentiate between these different credentials, given that there's not necessarily a commonly accepted definition of them? And this is how we think at WorkCred about distinguishing these different credentials. And so here across the top, you can see the different types of credentials, certificates, certifications, degrees, and licenses. And when we look at those characteristics going down the left-hand side, right? Who is issuing the credential? Why is it issued? And then things like completion time, renewal requirements, and then we offer examples. And you can see, right, that these credentials actually differ quite a bit along these different characteristics. The thing we also really care about at WorkCred is quality of credentials. And so we look at accreditation as one of those markers of quality. And so we see, right, for many of these credentials, there are standards for accreditation, and that's something that we do focus on. And we think about, right, how are those developed, who's developing them, and then what is the accreditation process? That's, I think, something very familiar to most higher education institutions, which may have both institutional and programmatic accreditation, but those also exist for other credentials. I still want to say, though, even with all of these sort of characteristics, there's a lot of variety within certificates and certifications, to certainly about, you know, what those different how you can distinguish different characteristics of those. Next slide. And so I think we wanted to take a minute here and hear, as all of you are doing, or maybe you're working on non-degree credentials, if you are, right, how mature are your efforts right now around these non-degree credentials at your organization or institution? So we'd love to take a minute, if you could look in the chat and submit a vote. So I'll say when we do these, we do this type of polling when we're working with higher education institutions at WorkCred, and we really see folks everywhere along these 4 categories. And I think part of that is because, right, this is a really exciting field for innovation in higher education institutions in the US. And so, but institutions, right, some want to take a little more time to jump in, and some are sort of ready to go and get started. So any last takers? But it looks like what we're seeing here is that about half the folks are sort of thinking about it early, but you have about half who have launched or have pretty mature micro-credentials. So that's really, really exciting to hear about. And I think that later on, Helen, we're going to ask more specifics about those. But I'll turn it back over to you, I think.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel, for kind of really establishing some, basic foundation for our discussion. And I think one thing I will say that as we look at, for about half of all of us, in the early discussions, but even those that are still in progress, that, one thing that as we've had these discussions with our colleagues here, looking for those resources, where are some resources, references, case studies, if any come to mind for you, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're hoping to actually, we will be creating a summary of any resources, that are shared in the chat, or if you want to share your own institutional story or websites and so on, and we'll provide that as a resource after this session is over. So now we'd like to go ahead and transition to this question: why non-degree credentials? Why do we think this is something that is particularly needed? Certainly, in the process of developing our chapter, recognizing that that non-degree credentials in engineering, as they connect to degrees, can fall in three general areas. Stacked credentials is something that we're seeing where, along the way, students are able to actually, develop or include or achieve particular certificates. These of course create greater flexibility for students, especially students who might be looking for an on-ramp into a degree program, and also increasing access to education, and particularly credentials and other kinds of representations of learning, particularly for underserved populations. The other way, of course, is that non-degree credentials being embedded within a degree program, that they supplement and enhance particular educational offerings. They may offer another means to respond to new advances in technology. Maybe a decade ago, it was maybe how do you get up to speed on, autonomous vehicles, for example. Today, no question, it's AI. How do you reskill, upskill around AI? Is it something that you are necessarily going back to school, going back to your institution to get another degree? Probably not. So then where are those opportunities for learning? And then lastly is this idea of aligning non-degree credentials with degrees, whether to address evolving and emerging needs or strengthen those partnerships between academia and industry. Isabel, I wonder if you might be able to say a bit more about this, given your perspective.
Yes, thanks, Helen. I would be really curious to hear about others' experiences, but WorkCred, we often work with higher education institutions to think about non-degree credentials and exactly these pieces, right? Are they stacked? Are they embedded? Are they aligned? And how do they fit in with the other program offerings they're doing? What we have seen in engineering programs is that often we see aligned non-degree credentials rather than stacked or embedded. And part of that is because the engineering curriculum for the undergraduates is already has so many requirements that that idea of actually embedding another credential is very challenging for faculty to get into the curriculum. Whereas when you have, aligned, which could be offered either co-curricularly or extracurricularly for the students, that is easier for faculty, even if it's faculty led, that is an easier approach for them to add in additional material rather than trying to embed it into their sort of formal engineering curricula. And so that's really, we have tended to see a lot more of the aligned approach in engineering programs and sort of other similar type programs in the folks we've worked with in the United States.
Thank you, Isabel. All right, so we have another poll here, and really asking about what kinds of non-degree credentials does your organization issue, align, and or embed into your programs? So Alex is going to launch that.
And I would just be curious for those who are talking about certifications or industry-based certificates, if you don't mind putting them in the chat, sort of which ones are offered. We at WorkCred work particularly closely with certifications. And so it's always interesting to hear sort of how, which ones of those are commonly used with higher education institutions. No pressure, but if you want to, please do put that in the chat.
Isabel, do you see much? I see about a third here around the micro-credentials and badges. What do you see around, badging efforts? And maybe that's a kind of an easier entry point, into this space for higher ed institutions.
Yeah, I think badging. So for those of you who were paying very close attention, when we had our chart earlier with our different non-degree credentials, we did not include micro-credentials and badges as one of those 4 that we distinguish. And part of that is because those have the very loosest or have the broadest range of what that means when in terms of, the clear signal it can represent from a higher education institution. So we do see that micro-credentials and badges are often, at least with the partners we've worked with, the easiest way for higher education institutions to innovate, in part because they often don't require any accreditation process, and they can, there may not be the same governance systems in place to which on the positive side, right? That means that they are able to be developed quickly and offered quickly and be changed quickly to really meet changing workforce needs. And so we do often see that higher education institutions will focus on offering badges or micro-credentials because they tend to be, I think, less burdensome in terms of having to launch and maintain in terms of sort of the internal structures, and easiest to change and sort of update quickly. So we've seen a lot of explosion, I think, in those 2 areas in particular. So I think it's nice to see that is reflected as well in the poll here.
Well, that seems like a great lead into this next slide then, as we talk about it, that it's not just about creating it and putting it out there, but what are all the other considerations?
Yes, thanks, Helen. So this is also a slide that we commonly show at WorkCred because I think that, we talk to a variety of different audiences. And one of the things that we want, the folks we're talking to understand is sort of, while I think particularly in higher ed in the United States, while higher education, right, is certainly a very important player or partner in the credentialing system, they are part of a much, much larger system. And so here you see in the bottom right-hand corner, higher education, but you have a number of other folks who are influencing it, influencing that either directly or indirectly. Certainly you see accreditors, you see professional associations, and, it is really important as we think about, as folks think about offering a new credential, these are both the folks who are influencing, these are also consumers of credentials. And so it's really important, I think in some ways, right, higher education issues a degree, it's many of these or all of these, other folks who are in the credentialing system understand what a degree means. And so they can consume it when they make changes to something they understand in, at least in some basic way, sort of what impact that might have on a degree. As you issue these other non-degree credentials, it is less clear, right? I think throughout the system, how those interact, how they might be used, how changes to one part of the system might influence another part of the system. And so this is really, something that we want folks to think about is how does their credential and how does their institution fit within the larger system? And the last thing I'll add to that is, at WorkCred, we think the overwhelming number of non-degree credentials actually are issued and exist outside of the higher education system. And so, as we think about how, higher ed both interacts with and itself issues non-degree credentials, that they really are one piece of this broader credentialing system. Next slide. And so one of the things that, you know, we at WorkCred like to think about as a way to then further, you know, offer insight into what your credential means to other folks in your system is, you know, how do you distinguish? What are those distinguishing characteristics so that as you issue a credential, it has clear value and transparency to other folks who are consuming it. And so for this is with certification. In certification, we have something what we call degrees of rigor. So these are the different characteristics, right? We think all certifications have a standardized exam. Then there are different other characteristics, right? The raise certification requirement, which signals continued competency over time. The ability to revoke certification, that signals for many, it can be, that usually involves a code of ethics. Certainly important in engineering, right? That you have to follow rules or there can be real, you know, consequences to public safety. And so that's right, another degree of rigor in terms of making sure that you understand those and you meet those standards in your professional life. And then of course, accreditation, which encompasses the things below it and other sort of rigors in terms of, you know, how the exam is developed and how often it's updated and things like that. And so, you know, we think that this is, as you think about non-degree credentials, because they have more variety and definitions by the issuers, then it's important to think about what are the other characteristics that can distinguish those and make signaling easier for folks who are consuming those credentials. And
Thanks,
next slide.
Isabel.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, so I think where we'd like to switch to now is really thinking about needs, you know, and maybe it comes down to this question like, why are we doing this anyway? You know, what kinds of needs exist that aren't currently being fulfilled by our current degree programs and offerings? So here I turn to my colleagues in the Stanford Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, also known as the D School. You know, this idea of taking a design thinking approach. And the first step of design thinking, the design thinking process, is really empathy for who we're designing for. I think Isabel has already mentioned, you know, some of the needs that have emerged and evolved. And then from an institutional perspective, higher ed institutional perspective, although perhaps also from an industry organizational perspective, you know, how do we meet those needs? The needs of our students as we're trying to prepare them for future careers, the needs of our institutions as we're trying to stay relevant. A word that, you know, has been mentioned is like, how do we innovate in this space? That it's not just, as institutions, we're not just offering the degrees that we've always offered, but really looking to the needs of the workforce, the industry, you know, our, you know, economy, our society, all of these areas, you know, to meet those needs. And so that as an institution or organization, we could continue to evolve and also, you know, be responsive to what we're seeing in the world. So a framework that Isabel is going to speak more about shortly, a framework that WorkCred developed to develop and integrate micro-credentials into undergraduate experiences, begins with this sort of needs assessment. I'm going to actually talk a little bit more about this idea of looking at credentials as a form of representation before I turn it over to Isabel to talk a little bit more about what she's seen on the needs assessment side, particularly from WorkCred. So as we think about credentials as a new form of representation that perhaps in addition, that goes hand in hand, you know, with the degree, you know, some questions arise, you know, from my perspective. So what do credentials aim to represent? You know, what are the types, the categories, the forms of student data and or evidence of learning that we are now trying to represent? In, you know, let's say about 10 years ago, I spent some time working in our office of the registrar, really learned a lot and thought a lot about how we would design the traditional academic transcript, the transcript that represents the education of our students that they you usually pick up on their way out of the institution, mainly because somebody else requires it. But at the end of the day, when they walk across the stage at graduation, the transcript is really all that's left, right? It's like the diploma they might put in a frame and hang on the wall of an office and everything, but it really is the academic transcript. Yet so many parts that are unique to our, the educational experience of our students is actually not captured on an academic transcript. And now we're introducing credentials into the mix, particularly non-degree credentials. Are they showing up on a transcript? If not, do they just show up on LinkedIn? Do they show up on a resume? And then where is that validation and verification of that work? And that's why I think when Isabel put up her earlier slide of the graphic of all of the different players that are part of this space, how do we ensure that as we're thinking about developing new credentials, that we're engaging those partners and collaborators? Now, the second is for what purpose and for whom? Like, what are the limits and constraints of current degree programs as well as credentials, and why? What do current credentials aim to achieve, support, or facilitate? And again, what needs do they address? As well as who are the recipients of these credentials and how well do these credentials address their needs and what they want to know and also what they want to be able to do? So really thinking about for what purpose and for whom. Now, the other component is this idea of by whom. Who owns the credential? Who is creating and or curating it? What are the concerns around validation, security, authentication, addressed in addition to the legal, governmental, and social practices, particularly around traditional record keeping? There's been an effort in the the U.S. Bureau of Commerce, I think, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where they've been really looking at the kind of technology infrastructure. There was some discussion about blockchain technology. Is the record something that is still owned by the institution, or how can it be owned by the individual as they're navigating their different multiple careers across a lifelong learning career? Now, so in that mind, then, instead of one official record, what are the opportunities and potentially the risks associated with moving towards multiple records, representing diversity and purpose, audience, as well as creators and curators? And then lastly is this idea of intention to signal, is this a new kind of currency? And in our chapter, we do actually build upon and talk about sort of that idea of signaling, to what extent might credentials become a form of economic currency, both for the student as well as for the institution or organization? What do non-degree credentials signal? Is it specialized skills? Is it technical competency? Is it out of degree specialization, professional development? And how might this metaphor, perhaps, of financial currency help us understand the granularity of alternative forms of validation, of learning, stackable credentials, and competency-based learning? So in developing the chapter, the questions that we were grappling with were around this idea of signaling, as well as this idea of representation, and represent credentials as representation of some aspect of learning or skills. And then broader from that would be the record. What is the record, as from the institution for an individual to carry as they move on through their careers. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Isabel to add her perspective as well.
Thanks, Helen. I think that, I just wanted to, for us, ground this a little bit in some work that we did. So we worked with the University of Texas system as they were thinking through offering micro-credentials. And we worked from faculty across 7 of the system campuses from all different departments and developed this framework about focus specifically on micro-credentials. But I would say, I think it applies more broadly to non-degree credentials. Thinking about undergraduate experiences. And we often start with what we call, a needs assessment. And, it is very specifically here, what are the resources, where's the demand, who are you going to offer it to, how does it fit within programs? But I would say, taking a step back from that, when we work with any of our partners, and certainly higher ed partners, they're asking us to help them think through, some sort of non-degree credential. We always ask them first, what purpose do you want to serve with this? What need are you meeting with this non-degree credential? And, you know, let's be very clear. Is it a need to signal certain competencies? Is it a need to highlight what you are already offering that you feel like employers don't fully understand? And just to make that concrete, right? Like, I have never seen anyone say, hey, I want to offer a thermodynamics micro-credential, right? That is not what folks are trying to signal for employers. We do see them signaling, right, communication, other things that are already part of the curriculum, critical thinking, problem solving, certainly technical skills. But then, right, are you trying to, you know, show that your students are able to understand some new technology, really understanding sort of what is the purpose you want to, what is it you want to achieve? What is the very specific goal for this credential? And then we go back and actually say, okay, now what credential, right, based on the characteristics of different credentials, what non-degree credential actually best would meet that need? And so really, I think for you know, at a very high level, right, thinking about why is it you are even offering a non-degree credential, right? And what goal is it meeting that is not met by your degree program that you are already offering? And go to that next slide.
Right. Thanks, Isabel. So now we'd like to hear from you, and we ask that you write into the chat, perhaps what kinds of non-degree credentials do you have or are you currently thinking about? And as a way to kind of better understand about where you're sitting in right now. Okay, great. Design thinking, excellent.
So I'll just say some of the ones that we have seen are, you know, things like project management, mechatronics. Oh, I see. This is great.
And Isabel, what do you see in terms of, you know, that balance between certificates for, you know, or non-degree credentials for more technical skills, technical areas versus, you know, sort of the professional, interpersonal skills?
We have largely, I think we've seen a focus on the technical skills when we're looking at engineering programs. But I will say more and more, I think we are seeing folks who are very interested in, you know, communication I think I saw one here in leadership. We're seeing some things like leadership or entrepreneurship. Those things that are, I think, really important, that can be really important in engineering professions that are not explicitly technical. But I would say the balance is more focusing on the technical skills.
Okay. Okay. And then, you know, one thing that we had talked about in our planning, Isabel, is sort of this, you know, it's not necessarily if you build it, they will necessarily come. I mean, this idea of offering it and then what's the uptake? And I was wondering if you might speak a little bit more about what you've seen on that side.
Absolutely. I think that you really nicely captured it. Is I think, you know, we have had some partners who really thought if you build it, they will come, and they did not come. And so what we now tell all of our partners is that as you are developing this micro-credential, again, along with this goal, understanding sort of who it's offered to, you have to go and then go through the process of getting folks to buy in and sign up and complete the micro-credential. And so that is faculty education, right, in terms of making sure the faculty who are not involved in developing it understand sort of where it fits in the curriculum and, you know, how their students might benefit from doing that micro-credential. It is the advisors who help students select courses and think about, you know, how this might fit with them. It is learners, right? Making sure that you are advertising to them, what they're involved in. And I will still say we still see, at least in the initial years, relatively small uptake, because for many learners, this is the pros we've seen, it is extracurricular or co-curricular, so it's something in addition they have to do. And we have seen more uptake when professors offer extra credit or some sort of incentive to get learners to be involved. But it is a resource. It is a resource you need to plan for to actually get students to enroll in the credential once it's offered.
So it's interesting, I mean, in terms of just also some of the financial considerations, like to really see this all the way through, what are the implications?
If you want to, I will just say it is, in the United States, what we often have the conversation we have is, the different types of learners. For those learners who are highly motivated, they're ready to do non-degree credentials. They often will need some support, but not a lot of support to both enroll and complete the micro-credential. For learners who maybe are not sort of those, most enthusiastic students, this is, they need faculty support or support from somebody to both enroll and persist. The completion rates are, from what we have seen, but with the folks we work with, are low. So if you want your students to persist, they need some support throughout the non-degree credential to complete it. And often, right, same resources at the institution, and so you're diverting resources to do this work, or you have to come up with additional resources to get those students to persist through earning these non-degree credentials. So just one more thing, to be considering as you're thinking about offering these, if you want to have a lot of students get through them and earn these credentials in addition to their degrees.
Yeah, it does make me wonder, like, are there some parallels or lessons to be learned from, how MOOCs rolled out, in terms of who was actually, who was taking MOOCs, the completion rates there, in addition to even transition to online learning, like offering, opportunities for online learning for students to take their courses online, but again, recognizing that's a different kinds of skill set in order for a student to be a successful online learner. Thank you, Isabel. I think we'll go ahead and transition now to thinking about future directions. What are some questions to consider and keep in mind? And I think Isabel has already, sort of highlighted some of these, but maybe if you want to expand upon some of your points that you made earlier.
Yeah, I think, as just to reiterate a little bit, right? Really thinking through, and we have in that the link I put in earlier, and in this work we did with the University of Texas system, a series of questions that are considerations for those who are, right, thinking about starting some sort of or offering some sort of non-degree credential. And they really here, right, they're about fit, they're about, how does that interact with the other programs you're offering. It's about governance, right? How do we manage this credential? Who's offering, how do the students learn and prepare to earn this credential? And the signaling piece for the employers of, how do you then signal what this credential means? And so, it really is a broad spectrum of questions, but these are what we sort of highlighted here, the sort of key decisions that we would like higher education institutions to think about as they are considering either developing their own non-degree credential or adopting one that already exists, in the world out there, either industry-based, a certification, or something else. And so these are the types of things that, there's no right answer. You just have to, things that we think are important to think about as you are going through this process. And, talk through this a little bit, but again, this is sort of the broader framework. I would encourage you all to go to our website and look at this, this publication. But it really, for each of these sort of little boxes, we have a series of questions to consider. as you think through them. And I think the one thing I'll highlight is you're doing all of these different pieces, right? The needs assessment, building the team, actually developing the micro-credential, then delivering it. You need buy-in. We've seen this. It's really important because it is a long process. It is, it's micro, when we talk about micro-credential or certificate, it seems like it's smaller, but it's still a lot of work to do. And so really getting that buy-in at all the different levels of your institution is a really important part of making sure that you can smoothly go through this process. And again, our publication has sort of more specific questions about, things you might want to think about as you're going through this process.
So as Isabel and I were preparing for today's session, we were considering, what's changed, since when we finished writing this chapter. I think this question about that came up in our work is, this question, how do we get funding for research that is not about degrees? And that, I think, remains true. Again, with a greater emphasis on whether it's work integrated learning or workforce development, perhaps those opportunities might become available. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, what changes in infrastructure might be needed, whether it's HR systems, student information systems, such that there is even a field, for being able to capture and document non-degree credentials and recognizing them. And of course, valuing them is another story, as Isabel alluded to earlier. And then lastly, how can we clarify, articulate, and leverage the signaling power of non-degree credentials? I think if we were exploring like theoretical frameworks for this work, it was really signaling theory that really stood out to me as something that is particularly relevant, in terms of why are we doing this? How is it being communicated to students? And then for students, both current students, prospective students, ways for certain, populations and groups to be able to look for an on-ramp into perhaps a more formal degree program. Certainly non-degree credentials represent and, can serve a function and meet a need in order to address that. So I think now what we'd like to do is actually perhaps, we've thrown a lot at you. It's been a bit of a fire hose of information, but maybe we'd like to give you an opportunity to do a little bit of reflection before we transition into questions. And so what we'd like to do is actually something that I learned from my colleagues in the D School, this idea of really giving you 1 minute to think and type into the chat, but don't enter yet. What kinds of ideas from today's session resonated with you? And also, what questions do you still have? So please take a minute. I'll go ahead and time it, and then type it in the chat, but don't press enter yet. So just a little bit of a time to reflect. Okay, I think if you'd like to go ahead and press enter now, and hopefully we'll see your reflections come in. Thank you, Robert. Okay, excellent. Great. So hopefully we'll see more of those come in as we, as you finish reflecting. And so I think now I'd like to, let's see, I think that's all we've got here. So thank you so much. Let me actually, okay, sorry, I'm having some issues with my thing here. Okay, great. All right, so thank you. I think now we'd like to go ahead and open it up to for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Isabel. There's one question already that came in from Colin. Colin, do you want to read it out yourself, or do you want me to read it for you?
I want to show off I can read, Christopher, yes. But my name's Colin Brown. I'm a visiting professor at City St George's University in London.
Right.
And I was just wondering, I'm really picking up on Helen's very last line on her penultimate slide, which is, what is the signaling power of these non-degree credentials? Do they have any, is there any evidence they have an effect on the cohort that then applies to come onto that course?
Mm-hmm. Yes, evidence. I think, yeah, it's a great question. And that I have to say was a challenge when we were writing this chapter. Where is the evidence, and where is this also the funding and the support to do this kind of research of the impact? Isabel, I wonder if you might have additional perspective there.
Yeah, I'll talk. I mean, one, we're not seeing, right, when we talk to faculty, that's what they ask always, right? What's the evidence that's going to help? Why should we divert resources and time to doing this? And there isn't research, I would say, sort of to the level that I think people are used to seeing when they want to make decisions like this about credentials. What we know about is that schools internally are tracking how their learners are doing when they earn this. They're not making it public, but there are a few systems in the United States. The state of New York system, is doing this at scale, micro credentials and certificates at scale. They have their student metrics on that. It's not publicly available. Florida International University, a very large university here, has a very large program, very well organized. They have, but it's not being published. And so we would love to see, right, those institutions that are doing it publish on that. I will take a step back and say what we hear about when you're talking about signaling power. Most institutions, whether they'll say it publicly or not, they're relying on the name brand of their institution for signaling power. That there is trust built, right, in the name to say, okay, our institution is issuing this credential on leadership, and so we can trust it because we trust this institution. What we are also seeing in the United States is that many are also working with Coursera, which has developed a sort of suite, and there are other providers like this, right? But they have a number of offerings from well-known companies, right? Like the Google or but in a number of different fields, they're relying on their professional certificates as the non-degree credential that is as sort of the micro credential or whatever you want to call it, that's integrated into their undergraduate systems. So in that case, right, they're relying on the name brand of the other partner to have some signaling power.
Is that okay, Colin?
Yes, it is. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, if the broadening of the degree broadened the people who applied for it. I think that would be a goal that we would certainly like to have at City St George's.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also, I mean, it was the whole idea around, the push around skills-based hiring, to make it so it isn't just the reputation of the institution or that you're an alumnus, from and things like that to make that possible. But although, Isabel, I think when we were talking about this earlier, you mentioned that about skills-based hiring, that it's not skills-based, it's really credential-based. Is that what you said?
So when we talk to companies, right? I mean, the issue with I know there's progress towards developing some sort of common skills taxonomy, but many companies internally have their own skills taxonomies. And so then you're trying to, make things connect, and that's very challenging. But many companies will, when they're talking about skills-based hiring, and there's a report on this that came out maybe a year ago, they're actually talking about hiring based on non-degree credentials, things like certificates, certifications, or pre-employment assessments. So it's not removing, right, some sort of third-party validation. It's just changing that from being a degree to other types of credentials or validations. They still want that validation that is not self-attestation and can be shown in some sort of rigorous way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anniko.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting and for me very, how I think, interesting, you know, what you shared about the micro-credential, because I am the expert of the lifelong learning, and you know that this is always a question and a challenge, that how can we implement the lifelong learning. And I think one of the result of that one is the micro-credential. And in my university of the Budapest University, it started in 2022-2023 when they started and they gave, you know, the badge of the micro-credential. But the question is really through, and the question from my side, you know, that how do you think that this micro-credential, because when I started the whole lifelong learning and the Hungarian network of lifelong learning, they were very much refused from the higher education, that they don't want to give any micro-credential because they said that they are, you know, a university which, you know, can give only the bachelor or master degree, but they don't want to give any micro-credential. Nowadays, it has changed because they accepted that that has happened, that we should somehow to accept that we need the micro-credential because there are the skills, there are the competencies. So I don't know that how is your experiences, that how the main universities, those universities who are in the ranking list, you know, how they deal this question of micro-credential, because now I see that from my side of university, they try to give, you know, the micro-credential because of the workforce, because this is the needs analysis. So how do you think that one, that it is mainly because of the workforce challenges, because you mentioned that maybe it can be from the student side, maybe it can be, you know, from the higher education side. How do you see that one? What is the main reason why this micro-credential, you know, it has really the availability and the really main of we should somehow to contain with that one?
I'm happy to start and then turn it over to Isabel, since Isabel sees, you know, many institutions. It's a great question, Aniko, and I see my colleague Robert Prakash here from Stanford. I mean, universities now offer, whether it's continuing education, opportunities for professional development, certainly the ability to offer, to provide courses online opens up that possibility, especially, let's say, from, you know, from Stanford University, we can serve alumni from around the world. We're no longer constrained by just serving the alumni or local community that are, you know, in close geographical proximity to campus. Certainly, of course, I mean, realistic, it's a market. It's a market now. We're competing, you know, with, you know, to serve, you know, people from a variety of companies, from, you know, through various partnerships, you know, individuals who might be drawn to the reputation of Stanford. And I think the lifelong, life-wide learning consideration is huge, you know, in terms of the opportunities. It's not just, you know, I come from my four-year degree or my graduate degree, but I will have those needs, you know, throughout the rest of my life. And, you know, who else to go to? You know, who do I trust? I trust the institution that I perhaps graduated from. At the same time, we see a lot more players, you know, as, you know, evidence in Isabel's figure, that, you know, it's no longer just higher ed institutions that are providing these kinds of learning opportunities. It's companies, it's LinkedIn Learning, it's, you know, Amazon, it's Google, all Deloitte, you know, whomever it might be. We have, as a consumer, I now have my choice of a variety of places, and who should I go to? How do I choose? And there are some organizations such as like the QA Commons or the Credential Registry that is, you know, providing those opportunities. But Isabel, you know, more thoughts?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it is, when we talk to institutions, right, they really have different appetites for offering these types of non-degree credentials. We've heard some that, you know, will say we're not going to offer them. We feel like it dilutes our brand value. And that is sort of where they are. And we're not seeing them jumping in. And you see other institutions who, you know, are, you know, very well respected institutions who are jumping in and saying, no, we're going to do micro-credentials. We do see it as a way to connect with our alumni. So I'll say the University of Texas system has in its partnership with Coursera, which offers a number of different certificates that you can earn that are, I think, very professionally relevant, very focused on upskilling and workforce skills. They're offering it to all of their enrolled students and all of their alumni. And I think that is, you know, a way for them to continue to show value to their alumni. And they offer it to all their faculty as well. And so, you know, I think that different institutions find different ways to find value in offering these, you know, and it really does, we see as we have these conversations, right, it's very dependent on sort of where they see their needs are and how they'd like to grow.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that great question, Aniko. I see that we're at time. Again, want to respect everyone's schedule today, but really want to express our appreciation and gratitude for inviting us to join you, and also for you to spend the time with us to explore these still emerging and evolving questions and issues. I put my and Isabel's contact information into the chat in case you'd like to follow up to continue the discussion. We will welcome your questions. I think we're all in this together, trying to figure it out, but we'll turn it now back to Chris.
Helen, Isabel, thank you so much, you know, for bringing alive the chapter and for the real examples. I think you've outlined clearly that this is, you know, a wonderfully evolving area. There's still a lot for us to unpick in terms of terminology and what we call things, and trying to make sure we're talking about the same things. But there's, you know, a lot of potential I see from what you've said there in terms of its diverse uses. It's about embedding within undergraduate curriculum, being used more for lifelong learning. With that wonderful flexibility comes its own complexity as well. And that's something that I think that you brought up so well and needs to be worked out. Some things I've taken away that really resonate with me, that don't just jump in because you think it's a great idea. You effectively have to understand why you're doing it and who you're doing it for. I think there's obviously, you know, some aspects of work relevancy there that are really important. But whenever we're doing these, the idea of signaling and will they be understood by the people that are going to be, getting these certificates is really a kind of key area. So in terms of my kind of takeaways, I think future research, there's perhaps a conceptual, you know, educational aspect there. There's a systems aspect that you've talked to, and obviously then there's a practical workforce element. So I see there's a rich vein, you know, for ongoing continued conversations. And thank you so much for framing today's session very much about, well, here's where we are. Here's what we're still thinking about after where the book chapter is. And I really encourage people to please engage with Helen and Isabel afterwards. So again, thank you so much. We, you know, are delighted to have you with us and joining and running this SEFI at Work session. So thank you so much, everybody. And, you know, if we could just use the usual way of saying thank you, that would be very much appreciated. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
blessed
you.
have a blessed rest of the day, everybody. If it's the beginning of the day for you, or if you're finishing up, then enjoy the evening. And thank you, everybody. Please do look out for our SEFI at work coming up sessions. And obviously there'll be a video coming out of this one. So if you need to come back and look at this and look at the resources that Helen and Isabel have shared throughout this, then please do so. We really do hope you take something practical away in the future and coming weeks. So thank you, everybody.